This video will talk about SSH keys and AWS. Before I talk about how these two things relate to each other, I need to talk about SSH keys, provide a general overview of what they are and how they work, and then I'll talk about how they work in the context of AWS. So everybody is familiar with this concept of a key. We keep this in our pocket, we use it to open up a door. It's very simple. But in computer land, SSH keys are a little bit different. Instead of thinking of this as a key, we really need to think of this as a key pair, because this key has two components. It has a private key and a public key. So the private key is something that you keep hidden from other people. You keep that safe and you don't expose that to other people or systems. The public key is something that you willingly distribute to other systems. So the way I like to think about these two things is that there is a magic link between the private key and the public key. When the private key is installed and configured correctly and the public key is installed and configured correctly, these two keys form this bond between two different systems, and it makes these two different systems communicate with each other without worrying about authentication, without passwords, without exchanging tokens or anything like that. So in a sense, the private key and the public key is this magic link. And it's really important that you think about the SSH key as a key pair, and you'll know why in the next few slides. So sometimes you'll see the word key in this context, and whenever you see just the word key, it probably more often than not refers to the public key. And it's important, like I said, to realize that this key you should really think of it as a key pair. So to create a key pair, you can execute SSH keygen. And when you execute SSH keygen on your box, you will get a private key and a public key. And on the left, you can see an example of the private key. That is a real private key. That's what it looks like. And on the right is a public key. And if you execute SSH keygen, you hit enter, 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 you're going to create these two files in your .ssh directory. It's a hidden directory, and it will contain these two files, one file for the private key, one file for the public key. I like to pretend that there's a magic link in between these two things. So if the private key is deleted, it's destroyed, it's lost, it's never going to be created again, that sort of breaks the public key. The private key has to exist and it has to work for the public key to be usable. If the private key goes away, basically renders the public key unusable. So now we can talk about SSH keys and how they relate to AWS. And this is where things can kind of get a little bit confusing with terminology. So there are two areas in AWS where we run into keys. There's the EC2 key pairs section, and when we launch a new EC2 instance, we can encounter keys. So let's look at both of these instances. So here we are, we're in the EC2 key pairs section. We have clicked on key pairs, and we are presented with this dialog. So this is the first time that we've clicked on this, and we do not have any key pairs in this region. So it's important to realize that SSH key pairs are specific to a region. So if you're in North Virginia and you have resources in Ohio, you'll have to copy your North Virginia keys to your Ohio region. So keys only work in a region. So let's click on the Create Key Pair button. So when we click on that, Amazon executes SSH keygen or something like that. Don't really know for sure. I don't work at Amazon. Amazon executes this SSH keygen, and you will download a private key file in the form of a .pem file. So the .pem file is the private key, and Amazon will create the public key and store the public key in the cloud. And that is the fingerprint that you're seeing there is essentially the hash of the public key. And you can't really download the public key from the console. You can get the public key in other ways that I'll show you, but there's no download button. So when you create your key pair in this context, you create the public key, it lives in AWS cloud for now, and you download the private key. So that's a little bit weird to me that I'm creating this key pair and I only have access to the private key. It's just weird to me, so I kind of don't recommend that approach. So let's look at this option. So we can click this button, the import key pair button. But before we click that button, we should execute SSH keygen on our computer so we generate the private key and the public key in these two files. And then we can upload our key pair to AWS. And this is where things get a little bit confusing with terminology. So the title of this dialog says import key pair. So you might be thinking, well, key pair means two, so I know there's a private key and a public key. Does that mean I upload my private key and my public key? And the answer is no. If you scroll down, if you look a little bit further, you can see that we're just uploading the public key. So it can be a little bit confusing where it says key pair. Does it mean private or public? And so as a general rule, when you're talking about SSH keys, it's usually the public key, and you should really never upload your private key to anything. That's just a red flag that you're not doing something right or not understanding anything. So this is where the terminology can get a little bit confusing. So in the other case where we launch an EC2 instance, we can either select an existing key pair or create a new key pair. So in this case, we'll create a new key pair, and when we create a new key pair, Amazon will tell us to download the private key to our desktop, and it creates the public key and it stores it in our little key pair manager here. And when we launch the instance will be launched with the public key in the authorized keys file. So the public key will live there. So that's a little bit weird to me because we're telling Amazon to create the public key. I can't really download it from the console, but the public key will get put on the computer, and I have this private key on my box somewhere. So that just seems a little bit odd to me. So what I recommend is using an existing key pair, and when you launch an EC2 instance, always my recommendation is to use the key pair that you imported from the import key pair button on the previous screen. So it just makes managing keys just a little bit easier. So like I said before, when the private key and the public key are created, I'd like to imagine that there is a magic link between these two keys. So when a key is installed on system A and a public key is installed on system B, these two systems can just automatically talk to each other. So in this case, the private key is installed on my computer and the public key is installed on EC2. We can just very simply SSH into the EC2 instance without specifying a PEM file. We can also use tools like Ansible to manage our server. So in this case, this is a very simple task from a playbook that installs the latest version of Apache. We can just run this playbook. We don't have to worry about authentication, passwords, tokens, anything like that. Things just automatically work. And another example is we can post our public key to our code repository of choice. We can access our code repository securely, very simple, without having to worry about passwords. So some of my tips and suggestions, I recommend generating your own key pair on your computer. Just execute SSH keygen. It will create a private and a public key in your .ssh directory. Another tip is you can easily copy the public key to your terminal using the cat command. And SSH copy ID is an easy way to copy your public key from your local system to a remote host. It'll add your public key to the authorized keys file in the remote host. And of course, back up your private and public keys securely. You want to save those. So summing up everything in this video, SSH keygen is used to create a private key and a public key. I like to think that there's a magic link between the private key and the public key. When the private key is installed on a system and the public key is installed on a system, these two systems work together without having to worry about authentication, passwords, tokens, anything like that. These two keys should be looked at as a key pair. You should keep your private key private, and you can make your public key as public as you want.